All right, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Club Z's fifth Eye on Zion webinar. My name is Daniel Brooks. I am Club Z's National Activism Officer. So tonight's webinar is Why is Left-Wing Anti-Semitism on the Rise? And before we introduce our distinguished guests, I wanted to say that this webinar series would not be possible without the support of our generous donors. And if you would like to experience more of this type of programming, please consider supporting us at clubz.org. Also, Club Z is happy to announce that for the next school year, we will be launching a new program for 8th and 9th graders, and we will share more info with you about this very soon. On to tonight's topic. Anti-Semitism finds currency everywhere on the political spectrum, but what is it about left-wing Jew hatred today that has growing mass appeal, especially among young people? An expert in the field, Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky, joins us to answer this question and help us navigate anti-Semitism on the left so we can all better fight it. Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky is a social worker, writer, and researcher committed to building intercultural learning and communication opportunities. She holds her doctorate in international and multicultural education from the University of San Francisco, Masters of Social Work from USC, and Masters in International Relations from the University of San Diego. She works with nonpartisan orgs combating anti-Semitism and anti-Black bigotry. Dr. Shufutinsky was a 2021 scholar in residence at the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, Oxford Summer Institute, where she worked to develop curriculum in critical antisemitism studies. Dr. Shufutinsky is also the Director of Education and Community Engagement with the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. So without further ado, thank you so much, Dr. Shufutinsky, for joining us in this most important topic tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here, be part of this. Thank you.
And so you can start, and you can let me know if you're able to share your screen.
Okay. Before I share my screen, I just wanted to introduce what I'm going to share. So in 2013, Jamie Unt wrote an article that was published in Everyday Feminism, and it was titled Intent versus Impact: Why Your Intentions Don't Really Matter. And if that wasn't the beginning, it was at least part of the beginning of the end of agency and responsibility. Of course, I think that the impact of actions are important, but I don't think that they're any more important than intention, which I'll get to in a little bit. Now, we saw the elevation of impact over outcome and how it took away attention from the very important ideas about intention and opportunity. We saw something come up where we saw impact being highlighted over intention, outcome highlighted over opportunity, and all of this in this narrow binary framework of oppressor versus oppressed. We experienced a shift away from agency and responsibility towards blame. And so under these conditions, we've seen anti-Semitism flourish. Ideology and ignorance replaced scholarship and accuracy. And I can't say that those are the conditions that are the sole reason why we're seeing anti-Semitism grow on the left, but I can say and demonstrate a little bit how those ideas are fueling anti-Semitism coming out of the left. In 1891, an educator by the name of Anna Julia Cooper, she penned an essay advocating for access for classical education for Black girls and women. At this time, it was, Reconstruction time, Black girls and women who were lucky enough to go to school received a little bit more of a domestic-focused education. So they weren't allowed to take classes in like Greek, Latin, etc. Ms. Cooper summed up her experience with this quote: "I devoured what was put before me, and like Oliver Twist, was looking around to ask for more. The importance of classical studies can't be overstated. This type of learning is rooted in ideas of reason and inquiry, debate and critical thinking. The elimination of these foundational tools has made it easier for the normalization of baseless ideology. So rather than discussion, we see sloganeering. debates transformed into hashtags, and thought has been simplified into an either-or binary that doesn't address the complexity of people and society. And instead, it allows for conspiracy theories to take root, and it shuts down discussion that challenges this type of ideological orthodoxy. Now, there's a lot of debate around the current form of learning in schools, and obviously with my title at the Jewish Institute for Liberal Value, I focus really highly on schools and education. And we're seeing a trend where many parents and students are moving towards classical education after feeling that the current system's been failing them. And I think that this, as a movement, like as it grows, the movement towards classical education, that we're going to see a trend of decreasing anti-Semitism on the left. So going back to intention versus impact, as social trends were imposed on educational ones, we saw schools begin to adopt what can be called more liberal or progressive policies related to education. Programming to address the achievement gap began to hyper-focus on outcomes, with calls for equal outcomes taking over common sense. Immutable characteristics like race and color were used to label and define and segregate people. And this often raises the question, okay, how does this relate to anti-Semitism? So I'm going to get there. When people don't easily fall into the category set out in this ideology, they become problematic because they challenge that ideology. And in order for us to follow this road of equity, it has to be true that anyone who's ever succeeded could have never faced oppression. If impact is all that truly matters, then why would we care about anti-Semitism? The Jews ended up okay, right? On average, in the United States, Jews achieve above the mean. So why should we try to disrupt Jew hatred? And we know now that the cause du jour on the left is social justice, which means standing up for oppressed people everywhere, or at least that's how it's manifesting. So what happens to those people and those groups of people who aren't categorized as oppressed? There's only one other choice: to get categorized as the oppressors. Those are the only two choices that are acceptable and that are presented in this ideology. And so now we've come full circle and we're right back to anti-Semitism. October 7th turned this paradigm on its head, at least just for a little while. There was a general confusion on the left about how to comprehend and how to address the fact that those whom they embraced as fellow oppressed people in need of paternalistic help ended up committing the atrocities that we're all very well aware of, and they even broadcast those atrocities for the entire world to see. So many left-wing elected leaders and human rights activists around the world didn't know what to say or do. So they did nothing and they remained silent. When confronted with the brutal truth that the people, that the people who refuse to self-define as victims can actually be brutalized, and that those who welcome the cover they're afforded by claiming to be victims can be rapists and kidnappers and murderers, they did nothing, for a time at least. And then they began to do what cowards tend to do. They denied and deflected. And they blamed the very people who'd been victimized. And I mean really victimized, not microaggression victimization. They blamed them for being victimized. And the underlying theme here is the ideology that paints people as either oppressed or oppressor, with the determining factor being, at least for the most part, skin color. And that fuels anti-Semitism. And so for now, at least, the ideological and political left have bought into this ideology, hook, line, and sinker. So I'm going to share my screen now so I can continue. So Yair Rosenberg, who's a writer at The Atlantic, defined anti-Semitism as a conspiracy theory. Unlike many other bigotries, anti-Semitism is not merely a social prejudice, it's a conspiracy theory about how the world operates. When we define anti-Semitism, when I define anti-Semitism, I'm going to refer to the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. So we're all kind of speaking the same language, where anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Natan Sharansky uses these 3 Ds to define and speak about anti-Semitism: demonization, delegitimization, and double standard. So what we see with demonization from the left is gaslighting. We see groups like JVP who claim to represent and speak for the Jewish community, excuse the violence on October 7th. They actually put out this post on social media on October 7th. The root of violence is oppression. So excusing everything that was actually still going on in Israel as being a reaction to oppression, which again falls back into that underlying ideology where intention doesn't matter, just impact does, where people are defined with we only have two choices in how to define people, either oppressed or oppressor. And the people that are defined as oppressed have full range, free range to do whatever they want because they're defined as being oppressed. We have the demonization of Israel, where Israelis, Israel, Jews are called the new Nazis, where there's this entire reframing of the world in order to fit the ideology that is coming from the left. Delegitimization, where the idea of a free, sovereign Jewish state is being delegitimized, and we're seeing it from the depiction of the former Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who is a well-known Nazi, and what's happening in our streets now, where in San Francisco, as across the country, we see students that are walking out of school in support of Hamas. And there are words that are attached to Israel as a state and to Jews as a people, where Israel's being called an apartheid state. Jews are being called settler colonialists. The entire identity, the entire Jewish identity of as a people, a nation, an indigenous people to the land is being delegitimized now as it was before. And the double standards, which we're seeing every day. So the double standards of a lot of social justice movements, which I'll get into, that have been kind of the banner of the political and ideological left. Well, that's only until it applies to Jews. So the previous slide, delegitimization, you hear on the left calls for decolonization, calls for indigenous rights, except for the Jews as the indigenous people of Israel. With the Me Too movement, the double standards of believe all women, standing up for girls and women's rights, unless you're Jewish. If my sound doesn't work, please let me know, Dan.
No.
Yes, I was right. So sorry. We're here to help. Tell us what happened.
I was at a music festival. We heard gunfire and everyone was running. I started running and then he grabbed me. He yelled something in Arabic and then he ripped my...
Sorry to interrupt you. You said he was yelling in Arabic.
Yes. So he ripped my pants and then he just...
Sorry, I just need a bit of background here. Are you Israeli?
Yes.
And your rapist was Palestinian?
He was a Hamas terrorist.
Okay, just, this is a bit awkward, but we can't help you.
But I was raped.
Do you have any proof?
Yes, he filmed it.
Yes, a little, please.
Don't take it personally. Management decided that all violence against Israelis is legitimate resistance. So sorry.
My daughter has been kidnapped. Please help.
Sure, just before we get started, are either of you Israeli?
On October 7th, mass terrorists brutally raped Israeli women and children before murdering them. There is no justification for rape and sexual violence. Rape is not resistance.
Yes.
In 2022 in New York at the New Paltz campus of SUNY, a student group for survivors of sexual assault kicked out, didn't allow Jewish Zionist students into the group. The reason given was that allowing Zionists in would harm the other victims and survivors that were part of that group. So again, we see the double standard, obviously, since October 7th, but this does predate it. And how we're seeing it come in on the left is the causes that the left has embraced. Those causes are openly embracing the ideology that is fueling anti-Semitism, which goes back to the oppressor versus oppressed binary. Saw something similar in 2021, Stanford University. There I believe it was the psychology department. They were hosting a training or webinar for a departmental one, an internal one, and it got Zoom bombed. And there were anti-Black and anti-Jewish slurs like in this Zoom bombing. After that happened, the department decided to hold a meeting, like to speak with everyone in the department and address the bigotry and racism that happened during the webinar, during the Zoom bombing. Now, when the Jewish professors, two of them, asked that they also address the anti-Semitism that they experienced during that event, they were told that they were centering themselves and they were decentering the anti-Black racism that happened. So again, the double standard where it was okay for the department to address the very real anti-Black racism that was there, but they couldn't also address or wouldn't also address the anti-Semitism that these Jewish professors experienced during that same meeting. And a lot of times we talk about the difference in social justice, and there is a difference between critical and classical social justice. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I think that it's important to note that the movements, again, the movements for girls and women's rights, the movement for victims' rights, the movement for inclusion does not include Jews using a critical social justice lens. An example on here where a Toronto shop owner proudly proclaimed that Zionists are not welcome in her store. I mean, we've seen this before decades ago in the United States, as you can see from the sign that I believe came from a shop in Alabama. And then the middle picture, which shows the demonstration, one of the many happening in the CUNY system, university system in New York, where it lists CUNY home to rats, cockroaches, asbestos, Zionists, and genocide-loving administration. And again, Daniel, if the sound doesn't work, like wave at me or something.
Let's see. Similarly, I think, yes, understanding Hamas, Hezbollah as social movements that are progressive, that are on the left, that are part of a global left, is extremely important. That does not stop us from being critical of certain dimensions of both movements. It doesn't stop those of us who are interested in nonviolent politics from raising the question of whether there are other options besides violence. So again, a critical, important engagement. I mean, I certainly think it should be entered into the conversation on the left. I similarly think boycotts and divestment procedures are, again, an essential component of any resistance movement.
Okay, I can stop sharing there. I just want to add one last point again, and after listening to Judith Butler, there's this, what we're seeing and experiencing is this push to kind of twist themselves into a pretzel to justify a lot of the beliefs and the alignments of those on the left that they've taken. Because what's happening in Israel, what's happening with anti-Semitism here in the United States and across the diaspora isn't fitting the narrative of the oppressor versus oppressed binary. And I think I'll stop here. Daniel, let's see if we have questions.
Yeah. All right, thank you. I can go right into some questions. That's okay? Okay, great. Dr. Shufutinsky, I am a school administrator. The social studies teacher at my school informed me that he based his curriculum on the 1619 Project. Incidentally, he told me recently that he believes that the situation is England's fault because Palestine, which clearly is short-sighted, especially for a world history teacher. I think I know what he was going to say. Finish. Anyway, he goes on. One of his students came to me recently and said that Black people cannot be racist because that's what the teacher taught him. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a lot. I'll start with the last one first. But this was actually an important part, and I'm glad that this person asked this question and brought it up. The idea that racism can only be perpetrated by people who are white ignores the world. It ignores the history of racism that has occurred everywhere people have existed. And it ignores the treatment of the Koreans by the Japanese. It ignores Rwanda. We can go on and on and on and list the things that it ignores and how ridiculous it is. It also minimizes the agency of Black people, because that is making a huge assumption that Black people never have power, never hold any position of power, if you believe that paradigm that racism is power and privilege, power plus privilege. If you believe that, then it means that Black people never have power. We're always just children and weak and subjects. It's bigoted in its own way. As far as the history teacher and teaching from the 1619 Project, I think we can have a whole talk on that. I'll try to keep this part brief. The 1619 Project was penned by a journalist, not a historian. The level of the level of historical inaccuracies in that document, in that mantra, doesn't meet the standard in the bar for scholarship. Is it a good story? Maybe. But there are a lot of good stories. Seeing that taught in the classroom as though it's historical fact and as though it's telling the story of the Black American experience is ridiculous and embarrassing. And I think that we see a lot of that happening in the social studies, unfortunately, in K-12 schools and in higher education.
No, it's interesting. There was a 1619 Project debate, I'll just say within my family, where a relative of mine had an assembly where that was featured. And, he thought it gave it a veneer of credibility, of course. And so we all sort of went about our online research, looking into it a little bit. This was years ago. And it raised a lot of questions. And it was just fascinating how that appeal to authority that really carries the day often, that's what wins people over, really. If it's good enough for a school administration, people really think, even people who are not politically, minded, it really wins over people. So
it also leans into, or leans away from, again, classical education, which has a standard for a level of scholarship that, out of many things, but that one piece of work doesn't meet.
Right. Before we go on to more questions, I will appeal to everybody. I'm sorry I didn't mention this in the beginning. Please add your questions to the Q&A box that you'll see on your Zoom, and I will get to them in order. So thank you. Okay, so what do you say to people who say that anti-Semitism is being fueled by Israel's actions, i.e. Israel's fault? Campuses are especially rife with that point.
So that fits the textbook definition of anti-Semitism. Again, you're blaming Jews for the actions of a government. That's part of the problem. And if people are using that as an excuse to go spray paint on a synagogue or chant outside of a day school or a Jewish preschool, there's nothing that Israel's doing that justifies that makes that not anti-Semitism. Right. And back to the double standard, when Asian Americans were being attacked on the streets here, all over the United States after COVID, being blamed for China's whatever, dealing with COVID, we were able to recognize that as a hate crime. The again, pretzel twisting that has to be done to kind of justify the blatant anti-Semitism, and people blaming, oh, well, I don't hate all Jews, I just don't like Bibi, so I'm going to go chant for the death of all Jews. It doesn't line up.
What do you make of more moderate people who identify as being on the left and their lack of pushback on unifying and on tying this pretzel? Is what part does that play?
I think it plays a big part, and it can be very difficult for people to push back on something if they've accepted the ideology, because then you have to unravel that. And I'm not saying that it's something that's easy and everybody can do. And I know a lot of people that say, well, yeah, I'm liberal, I believe in all of these things that are human rights. And then they add on or tack on something that shows that they're basing it on an oppressor versus oppressed ideology. And it begs the question that's been brought up by a colleague who's conservative, more conservative, conservative. He's to the right of me. and this has been raised in our field, we're both social workers, that people have said, well, you can't be a social worker and be a conservative. And thinking of, okay, there are these litmus tests being placed. So somebody who's maybe more moderate, but still is liberal and still is left of center, has to actually address the underlying ideology. They have to be able to define it. They have to recognize it. You can stand up for social justice and for human rights without having to use that oppressor versus oppressed binary framework.
What do you say to Jews who say that if you only renounce Israel, anti-Semitism now will go away? I live in an area with many JVP folks who tell me that Zionism is a form of white supremacy. Supporting Israel makes me racist, and people have a right to boycott anyone who supports the state of Israel. So I guess that it comes down to, if only paradigm, right? If only you condemn Israel or disassociate Israel from Jews, then we'll be fine.
A couple of things with that. First of all, they obviously don't understand what Zionism is. And that is a huge problem. That's not something small. People don't understand Zionism as the right to self-determination, the right to Jewish sovereignty and ancestral homeland, what Zionism as an indigenous rights movement. There's no understanding of that, so it's easy to say, if only you. The other part of it is I would say to them what I won't say here, which is something similar, that if people tell me, well, if only I straighten my hair, then people will treat me nice. But because I wear my hair natural or wear it in braids, then it's okay for them to call me the N-word and treat me like a second-class citizen. It makes no sense. And I think I just don't acknowledge people like that, to the point where, like, I'm not going to take away a piece of myself to satisfy somebody that wants to justify their ill treatment of me. And I do not think you can de-link Zionism from Jewishness.
This is my opinion, but my take that a lot of the, I would say, discomfort that even Zionist Jews have with Israel's actions, and not to discount any fair critiques people may have, but a lot of it seems to be surface and based on nothing more than maybe a global size level of peer pressure. So, and even sometimes, I remember years ago looking at certain images saying, oh, why did this have to come out at this time, or that these optics are so bad, or, not to say that if we didn't have the bad optics, Israel would be left alone. But, there's a sort of a personal discomfort we can internalize with that. It's almost like being in the schoolyard, but just on a mass level. You don't want to get picked on. Is that what would you say to that analogy?
I think that that's fair and it's valid. I also think that we have to acknowledge that why should Israel be held up to a standard of perfection when no other nation is, and no other nation should be? They will make mistakes. They will have leaders that are horrible and leaders that I think, oh, why is this person in office and in power and the rest of it? That's not anti-Zionist. Being an anti-Zionist, anti-Semite is saying, out of all people in the world, Jews don't have the right to self-determination. They have to live under the boot of someone else.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's
how common has that correction been for you about like what Zionism is, and it's not criticism of Israel or Israel's government? Have you had to correct people in real time about that? I mean,
of course, yeah.
It's pretty frequent. All right.
It is, but I think there's misunderstanding of who Jewish people are as a people. That is very prevalent, and I think that often people in the Jewish community, it's easy to not be aware of that people actually don't understand Jews as a people. But I mean, my question is, well, do you think that the Japanese should have Japan? I don't hear for anyone calling for the Japanese to give up Japan. So like, just looking at well, Jews are a people from Judea, Israel, like that sometimes that has to be corrected. Other times you have people that truly think that no country should exist. I'm like, okay, maybe, but why are you starting with the Jews?
Right. And those people really tend to be a lot smaller than they make themselves out to be.
Right.
Another question is, what are the origins of the binary leftist ideology of social justice, the oppressed versus oppressor? So to whatever extent you can talk about, because I know it can go back a way.
It can. About a century. The roots are, and I'm not an expert on this, Dr. Isabella Tabarovsky is, but I listen to her because she's brilliant. And so I'm piggybacking off of what she's can say in a much more eloquent way than I can. It really has its roots in Marxism and Soviet Marxism. It has it in the protocols of the Elders of Zion and Zionology, all of these anti-Semitic ideas that came out of the Soviet Union that elevated the hated group into to such a position that they deserved whatever happened to them and deserved to be taken down and dismantled. And what we're seeing now is a resurgence of that. Now, while it started around 100 years ago, there was a resurgence also in the 60s with through the Black Power movement, the rise of the PLO, those types of things that also piggybacked on Soviet propaganda, where there was this oppressor versus oppressed binary. And here in the United States, especially in California, we saw it through the rise of the Third World Liberation Front, where there are all of these calls for the third world peoples to unite against the first world peoples, the colonizers, et cetera, et cetera. And we're just revisiting that again. And that's the whole, history doesn't repeat, but it echoes. I look at it like instead of a timeline, we're on a spiral. So we come back around maybe at a different position, but we're coming back around to something that we've seen before.
Yeah, this comes from Olga Washington. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Brandy. What are your thoughts on the anti-Semitism among conservatives, e.g. Candace Owens, and the argument that calling out anti-Semitism is actually an attack on freedom of speech?
Calling something out isn't an attack on anything. I think that I was told when I was in undergrad studying political science that the horseshoe theory was, no, that's not real. Well, things have tended to show it's different. The very same tropes that we see coming from the far left are coming from the far right. I actually see, I don't know what she really believes. It seems like she'll say whatever she needs to say to get a certain level of attention. So celebrity stuff aside, I'm like, I think what she said and how it's dangerous is because it fuels a lot of the same type of anti-Semitism we've seen. And anti-Semitism isn't partisan. It's not going to say, oh, okay, I'm not going to come attack you because you voted, Republican, or, oh, I'll leave you alone because you're a Democrat. It's a hatred and an attack on Jews, period. So whether it's coming from the left or the right or the middle, I don't think matters that much, except where people excuse it or ignore it, which we've seen historically over at least the past few decades. When anti-Semitism is coming from the left, it gets minimized or ignored.
Right. There are a couple of questions that have to do with solutions, and I want to save them towards the end. They're really good questions. Here's a feel-good comment, and I happen to agree. Please tell Dr. Shufutinsky that I had the honor of hanging out with her son Noah for 2 days earlier this month when he was here in the Bay Area. He's an amazing human, and now we see where he gets it from. So I haven't had a chance to meet him, but his work is amazing, and you should just keep it up. I mean, it's just, yeah. So another question, it relates to universalism versus particularism. And often that nexus is seen as sort of that dividing point between left and right. Whether that's overly simplistic or not, it still is sort of defined often that way. Would you say that that is a misreading a little bit? Because it's not necessarily, leftism or, left-wing thought isn't necessarily all about universalism, right? There, of course, people make allowances for nationalism and also particularism. So can you speak to that point? Is that too broad of a framing?
I think it might be a little bit, well, I don't know. It might be a little bit too broad. The way I see it is that for Jews as a people, Jews are both universal and particular, and there aren't many other groups that are that way. So we're hard to define. Now, which means that for the left, for who I do think are broadly more universalist, it's hard to then accept the particularities of Jewish peoplehood. How that fuels anti-Semitism, I think it could just be similar to not being able to label, identify, put in a box of people, or they're not fitting in the boxes that the ideology purports. So that can be something that fuels the hatred.
A comment reads, I feel as though there's a growing rift between the Jewish community and the Black community. If you agree, is it anti-Semitism or a matter of convenience in order for the Black community to impress the Free Palestine movement?
I think that this is a little bit complicated, and I'm happy to get into it a little bit right now. First of all, just like Black people can be racist, Black people can be anti-Semitic. So the idea or the thought that Black people would never have believe anti-Semitic thoughts or ideology or conspiracy theories is ridiculous. I think that there also was, we see going back to the timeline in America, we saw pockets of cooperation between the non-Black Jewish community and the non-Jewish Black community, from the Rosenwald schools through jazz music, through civil rights, and then it kind of stopped. And there's something that happened at that stop. The same time that we saw Black rights movements go more radical was also the same time that we saw a rise in Arab nationalism, the PLO, etc., fueled and supported by the Soviet Union. That same source was fueling and supporting the Black Power movement. Well, lo and behold, it fueled anti-Semitism. And there hasn't really been a reconnect between the non-Black Jewish community and the non-Jewish Black community since then. So when you hear people talk about, well, we worked together during civil rights, they're talking about something that's before how much of the generations that are on the university campuses or that are teaching in the K-12, like they weren't even alive yet. And then there also isn't the conversation about, it wasn't just Jewish people helping Black people with civil rights. There were so many Jewish professors that were lucky enough to escape Nazi Europe that couldn't get professorships in predominantly white institutions because they had quotas or didn't allow Jewish professors, and historically Black colleges and universities hired them on. That, like, this knowledge isn't discussed or spoken about, so that the real understanding of who these communities and the people that contributed both ways isn't known.
Right. A couple more points on this relationship. Picking back off what you just said about the contributions of Jews that maybe are more unsung. And I'm not very versed in the subject. Maybe you could speak to it. Jews in education and in pushing more liberal education, especially in the 60s and 70s, that was more inclusive of the narratives of indigenous peoples and Black people. And I was a student of that in the early 80s. I could even tell from year to year the shift in some of the books, the social studies books. So I don't know if that doesn't get enough play, or to what extent it was really, quote unquote, Jews pushing that, or just simply that was America moving more a little bit to be more inclusive. But I don't know if you know about, Jews in education and how much Jews have pushed, or tried to center Black narratives.
I think that there's a history of that. And I think that goes back to the early 20th century when we saw this relationship between Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, and creating schools that educated upwards of 600,000-700,000 Black students in the rural South. So I think that connection has been there to be inclusive, not just of Black narratives and Black stories, but access to education for Black kids. That's been a thing, and that's been an underlying kind of common thread that has tied these two communities together. But again, that was a long time ago. The piece that gets missed is in Jewish education. There's still always been a foundation of classical education, and that hasn't necessarily been the case for the rest of the American demographic.
Here's a question regarding anti-Zionist Jews, which is something that our community unfortunately deals a lot with. Please address the vehement anti-Zionist feeling among left-wing Jews in the US and the UK, who appear to associate Zionists, ironically, with fascism. I know that's a topic unto itself, but what is the appeal, you think, and why is there this a growing push for Jews to be a little more identifying as anti-Zionist, even though it's still a minority?
I think I can't speak so much to the UK. I'm not British, so I see the similarities, but I'm seeing it from over here as an American, so it's hard to speak to that, and I don't want to speak on a subject that I'm not well versed in. As far as over here, I think that there's a push for conformity that is really it's a heavy weight that the younger generations are having to bear. The push to fit in, which is no different really from anybody that's going through their formative years. There's a peer pressure there. What I'm seeing is that it's off kilter because the spaces that young people frequent, by and large, not all of them, but by and large, are relatively homogenous as far as ideology and thought. So you think about where kids go, usually younger people are more liberal and more involved in social justice action. And as they get older, they tend to become a little bit more moderate. That's the typical trend. And I'm being very general here. But what happens is those spaces are ideologically homogenous. And that ideology is telling them that Zionism is white supremacy or is fascist or is a settler colonialist project. So there's the lack of awareness and understanding of what Zionism is. You know, it's this horrible thing. So who would want to associate with this horrible thing? If those people truly believe Zionism is racism, as anti-Semites have been trying to push for generations, if they truly believe that, of course they're going to say that they're anti-Zionist. Who would want to say that they're racist? So they have a basic like lack of understanding of what Zionism is. And I would say a lack of understanding of what it means to be a Jew as a people, as a nation of people, as an ethno-religious group.
Sticking with anti-Zionism, and now we could shift a little towards response. You know, I'm sure you've heard the framing of, you know, Zionism is a liberal cause. So, you know, you should support, and that obviously has more cachet among people who identify as being on the left. Maybe the term liberal seems outmoded. I don't know if people would say Zionism is a leftist cause, but is that one possible way to push back among people on the left who are willing to hear us out? And what would you advise in terms of maybe something? We're not always looking for the most pithy of responses, but if you only have a minute, you know, how do you approach that with a left-wing person?
To me, Zionism isn't a left-wing or right-wing thing. It's a movement for self-determination, and both conservatives and liberals and people on the right and people on the left should be able to engage in a movement for self-determination. I think that making it partisan is part of the problem. And it's just going to, even if right now, great, this one person who's on the left understands it and they're like, okay, if it's a liberal cause, I can get on board.
Right.
What that does is it pigeonholes it into this ideology that to me is the root of the problem.
Right. And that's an interesting point. I mean, it pigeonholes it and sort of perhaps pushes the threshold to reach a little further away. Because if you set it up as a left movement or a liberal movement, and it doesn't, you know, might not meet that standard in certain ways, if someone else might be open enough to look into it. So if you're just calling it something more universal, sort of keeps it a little broader. And I think that has mass appeal a little more. So that's kind of what I'm hearing, at least. I mean, it doesn't make sense to pander if it's really not accurate anyway. So that's what it comes down to, being honest. One question, interesting point. Black leaders contributed significantly to the struggle to free Soviet Jewry. So that's an area that I'd love to look more into. Okay, some very granular questions about the conflict, which I'm gonna, at least for now, skip over. In terms of looking forward, someone's communicating that they're of a former student in college who's depressed about the anti-Semitism, Hillel and Chabad they've reached out to, but is still very upset. She's tried sending, you know, resources. What would you recommend for a Jewish college student feeling so isolated? Is it a combination of things like intellectual pursuits? Is it reaching out to certain resources or communities?
I think if somebody's feeling isolated, one of the best things that they can do is find support so that they're not isolated. I cannot imagine what it feels like to be a Jewish Zionist university student on campuses right now. I mean, for me, it's terrifying. Noah's our second of 4 kids. So we have 2 adult kids and 2 kids that are still in school. And our youngest son is a freshman in high school. And I'm dreading the thought that the situation at colleges and universities can be how it is now, or possibly even worse by the time he graduates high school and looks forward towards to go to university. I can't imagine what that's like. I think that being isolated and feeling isolated is one of the worst things that can happen. And so moves need to be made to push back against that. Before I started doing the work that I do now, I was an advocate for victims and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. One of the first things an abuser tries to do to his or her victim is isolate them. So one of the things we always say for safety, and I say it in this same situation because it very closely parallels the domestic violence power and control wheel, what's happening to Jews in the United States today, is if you feel and are being isolated, then you need to seek out community of people that will support you. And that doesn't mean you need 20 people that will support you. You need 1 or 2. people you can talk to, people you can lean on, people who will not say, well, if you only cut off this piece of your identity, then we'll accept you.
That's appreciated. And to those who are listening, please email both us and Brandy with questions like that about people who really need resources and community. We're happy to help, because it really isn't literally in the palm of your fingertips to find other people. Another comment. Can you recommend some good books? It could be either on this topic of left-wing anti-Semitism or something that has personally inspired you.
So it would be terrible of me not to say, of course, that I believe everyone should look at and read my co-worker, supervisor, the founder and director of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, David L. Bernstein's book, Woke Anti-Semitism. David's been talking about this and has laid it out for the past 2 decades about what he was seeing as being a professional for so many years, and his concerns and worry for the direction that anti-Semitism was taking in the United States. So that's a fantastic one. Another one is, and let me see, I have it over here next to me somewhere. Oh, Why the Jews, which was recommended to me by Dr. Naya Lecht, who's a fantastic educator, brilliant scholar. But the reason for anti-Semitism, the most accurate predictor of human evil, and then, of course, DAR Horn's People Love Dead Jews. I
have yet to read the DAR Horn book, but I've heard amazing things, and she's a great.
I mean, it was sitting on my shelf, and I was just dreading reading it because I was like, oh, this is just going to be like, yeah, that sounds about right. And I picked it up more recently and read straight through it. She's a fantastic writer, and unfortunately, it was so spot on. I mean, it was foreboding, but a fantastic read.
In terms of again, more responses to this, I would imagine that encouraging dialogue and relationships, I know relationships maybe are easier said than done, but at least calls for dialogue can go a long way. Beyond that, what are some responses for, because everything is so online now and social media oriented, but we're also trying to acclimate and prepare our teens to the college experience. And so there it is a lot of personal stuff too. So what would you recommend on a personal, physical level in terms of engagement with Zionism among left-wing peers?
I mean, that's what you do. That's what Club Z does, right? I mean, the groups that you have for young people, for teens, I think gives the foundation necessary for Jewish Zionist kids to go on a campus and be able to manage what that climate is like on campus. I think that that's a fantastic thing. On a different scale, as a parent, I think being aware of where we're sending our kids, where we're sending our tuition dollars is super important. The Amcha initiative tracks and is a fantastic resource where you can look up a university and look at what anti-Semitic incidents have happened on that campus. You can look up professors. So there are a lot of resources so that we're not going in blind into the college university setting without knowing a bit about what we're going to face. And I think knowledge is key here, knowing at least as much as possible what we're facing going on to that campus, being able to build the resources, seeing what communities, Jewish communities, Zionist communities are available to provide support, that's something that's important. And then the other part is advocating, self-advocacy and advocating for our people. I don't think that any of the lies that we're hearing should go unanswered. There are too many of us, there are too many organizations that are working day and night to respond. We're here as a resource, as we should be. And this is exactly why we do what we do.
All right, so DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's obviously a very hot topic right now. There is a debate that we've all been following within the Jewish community about, do we engage with it? Do we indulge it? Do we become a part of it and have Jews be, whether they're victims or not, but are we a part of it, or do we simply just throw it all out and try to get rid of it? So what is your take on that?
So like most things, I'm in the middle. I think that the underlying problem with DEI is all of a sudden it's become a grievance industry that holds entirely too much power. The purpose of DEI should not be for the oppressed people to have a voice. The purpose of DEI should be so that people who come from different backgrounds, different cultures, can better communicate with each other and better work together. Full stop. If somebody didn't have access to something because of something and it becomes known, they should be able to get access to it and be included. That's it. I think the idea that DEI that is about grievance should inform everything that we, wake up and breathe all day, every day is absolutely ridiculous. That this critical DEI is informing curricula, the books our kids are able to read, the affinity groups they're able to go into, the fact that there are affinity groups, the trainings that our clergy go to, it's ridiculous. And I wouldn't want Jews to be included in something that is fueling anti-Semitism. I don't see how that's an answer. I think that that's maybe it's a short-term answer for some people because then they get to keep the friends that they once had. But I don't think that that's an answer that's going to help stop the increase in anti-Semitism we're seeing. I think it's a huge mistake.
Thank you for sharing that. And I do think it's also a middle ground kind of thing, and depends on the time and place and who you're talking to sometimes. Just give me a second. I had a question coming up here. Someone actually points out, they wanted to know this. What was the second book? They got Woke Anti-Semitism and the DAR Horn People Love Dead Jews book.
Here, I have it, a commercial. Why the Jews?
Why the Jews? Prager. Okay. In terms of where we go from here, you were in your demonstration, you struck to me a little surprisingly positive note about there's pushback now, and perhaps we're turning a corner. Correct me if maybe I overread it, but we're saying that people are waking up to this, and classical education, classical liberal education is kind of on the comeback. What are the reasons that we can be more optimistic, and what are some other things that might fuel this sort of return to sanity, especially in the education system?
So I'm not overly optimistic.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
my
put
coworkers know that's not me. I'll be doom and gloom, Brandy. No, I think that the one things that are so ridiculous they can't last. That doesn't mean that they can't last too longer than we'd hope. I see that there is pushback because it's so apparent the damage that this ideology is causing in more ways than one. We're talking about anti-Semitism, which is very real and very important, especially right now. And it's also, there's other damage that's occurring because of this ideology. We're having kids graduate school who can't read and can't calculate. We're seeing the damage that it's causing. We're having kids get onto university campus and they don't know how to write an essay. So it's not preparing our country for the next generation of leaders. We're seeing people who, our military's undermanned, or we have people that you're trying to recruit from a pool of people who think that the United States shouldn't exist. At a certain point, it's going to reach that threshold. If it hasn't already, I'd argue that it has, that it presents a national security threat. So there can be a turn and a pivot away, which we are seeing. We're also seeing those who were so entrenched in this ideology really hold on tight, really try to maintain those reins, because that's what's fueling their power or access or finances or whatever you want to call it. So I don't think it's going to be an easy road and an easy pivot, but I do see people becoming more aware of what's going on. It really started with COVID and kids going to school on Zoom, and parents were like, wait, what in the world are they telling my children? And I think that was really kind of the spark. I think the post-October 7th reaction that we're seeing, that community organizations are coming into schools and telling kids walk out of school and support, globalizing the Intifada, where parents are like, wait a minute, what in the world's happening? I think we're seeing that. And we're seeing the powers that be try to maintain power and control.
So before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts or questions for us?
No, I mean, I think I'm really honored to be here. I think having more conversations like this that's super important. I just encourage everyone, parents, students, grandparents, community members, to become engaged. My aunt always says democracy is a participatory sport. We're lucky to still live in one. We need to participate in it and make sure that you're aware of what's happening on the local level, not just paying attention to what's happening on the national level, because a lot of the policies and decisions that are fueling anti-Semitism are happening at the very local level, and most citizens aren't aware of it. And if they were, they would push back against that.
No, you're right. I think that in the last several months, especially with these ceasefire resolutions, I think the American Jewish community realized the importance and the value of acting locally, thinking globally, acting locally, and we're seeing a lot of successes actually on the local level that they should not be taken for granted, personal outreach and organizing. So well said. How can we follow you? There's a website, of course, but how do we follow your work? What's the best way to get in touch with you if we need to?
I think email, so Brandy with a Y at jilv.org. And then, I'm on Twitter and all the rest of the social media stuff.
Easy enough to find. Okay.
Yeah.
And for those of us also, those of you out there want to connect with us, it's through email, info@clubz.org, and clubz.org is our website. Brandy, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. It's such an important topic, and you are fighting such an amazing fight. I see you on the podcasts that you're on, and you're tireless. And I think it takes someone who's tireless to really be in this muck right now. So really, we honor you, we salute you. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to make a couple of last announcements. Obviously, we all thank Brandy for joining us. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope that you can join us on our next Ion Zion webinar after Pesach. We'll have Naomi Khan from Regavim, for those who don't know. Regavim, an Israeli organization dedicated to the protection of Israel's national lands and resources as it fights back against the global NGO war against it. As a reminder, this series would not be possible without the support of our generous donors. If you would like to experience more of this type of programming, please consider supporting us at clubz.org. And as mentioned in the opening, Club Z is happy to announce that for the next school year, we will be launching a new program for 8th and 9th graders, and we'll be sharing more info with you about that soon. Brandy, thank you again. We hope to see you soon. And thank everyone for joining us, and have a great night.
Thank
Bye.
you.